Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to our Transition Accelerator seminar on Canada's trade reset, building the new economy. My name is Bruce Laurie. I'm chair of the board of the Transition Accelerator and president of the Ivy Foundation. And I'm thrilled today to have with us Aaron O'Toole and Bentley Allen. And we are going to basically discuss the existing challenges we have in Canada with respect to our trade relationships and look at how that is an opportunity for us to help build the new economy. Before we get to that, I would like to acknowledge that we are on land which we live, work, and gather, that is the traditional and ancestral territory of many Indigenous nations. We recognize the deep knowledge, leadership, and stewardship that First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have always brought and continue to bring to these lands. We are committed to listening, learning, and working in partnership toward a just and prosperous future for all. I'd like to also remind you that we will be taking questions at approximately 1:45. And there is a Q&A box to submit questions for the panelists, which we'll be getting to at the end of the webinar. As you saw in the preamble, there will be a number of conversations hosted by the Transition Accelerator on how Canada can bolster economic competitiveness through increased productivity, diversified trade, targeting projects in sectors where we have a strategic advantage, so please look out for more details following this event. So today's conversation will run until 2 p.m. Eastern, until 2 p.m. Eastern, yes, right. And we may go over by a few minutes to capture any audience questions if we drag on. So if you don't have a hard stop at 2 p.m., please stay on. I think it's going to be a vibrant conversation. So before we get going, Bentley Allen is a pathway principal at the Transition Accelerator. Bentley is a professor at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and has been working closely with us on developing what is, I think, by all accounts, extraordinary content to better understand how Canada can benefit both in advancing sustainability and advancing economic prosperity. Aaron O'Toole, I'm sure many of you will know as former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He is the president and managing director of ADIT North America. And as Aaron knows, I was a fan of his climate platform when he was running, and we've kept in touch ever since then. So Aaron, a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you. Bentley, I'm going to turn it over to you to set the stage.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you for all of you for coming today. I'm really excited to share some new analysis with you, and I'm also excited that we'll be able to engage in conversation with Aaron, who we've learned has a really deep background in trade, and so has a lot to teach me and all of you as well when we get to the conversation today. So over the last few months, we've really gotten a national conversation going here about what Prime Minister Carney has called a national emergency, which is that Trump's threats really have exposed Canada's economic dependence on the United States. And in this context, if we want to matter in the world, if we want to have geopolitical leverage, and if we want to secure our economic independence, we're going to need a trade diversification strategy. And my central argument in this short briefing here today is that we can actually do three things at once here. We can advance climate action, we can build the new climate economy here in Canada and secure a place for our firms in global competitive value chains. We can build up our industrial base with a more focused and purposive industrial strategy, and we can diversify trade and build new international partnerships all at the same time. This is really a once-in-a-generation opportunity to do all of these three things through what we're now calling, in a really inspired choice, nation-building priorities. And I think of how geopolitical shocks have created periods of nation-building in Canada and in other countries. I used to work on the Rideau Canal when I was a kid, and I was often reminded in that context that we built the canal in the wake of the War of 1812. So we have previously used tensions with our southern neighbors as an opportunity to think about what we want to be and how we will be secured as a nation, and to do ambitious and interesting things as a result. And we have another opportunity to do that today. But to do it well, we're going to actually need a focused and, I think, analytical approach to how we think about trade diversification. And so what I'll present today is the beginnings of what I'd call a trade diversification strategy that really tries to do two things at once. It tries to identify what we're good at, that is identifying Canada's fastest growing exports, but then also try to think about what the world needs. Find the biggest markets outside of the US. You'll see ex-US on the slides here. I'm going to say ex-US a lot just as shorthand, which is the world outside of the United States. Our conversation about trade diversification has to start by looking at what we actually export to the United States. And so this diagram here shows us in a visualization what that composition of our exports to the United States looks like. And right away, what we can see is that our dependency on trade with the US is dependency on trade in oil and gas. So we have 140 billion of net exports in oil and gas to the United States that we can't easily ship elsewhere. And in a way, Trump's threats have called a question that we were going to have to confront at some point anyway as a country, which is what we are going to do with our dependence on oil and gas exports. We're already seeing the energy transition really picking up pace. Just for example, one key statistic that is on my dashboard is that gasoline demand in China is down 6.4%. As they, the world's largest importing energy market, start to decline their energy imports, there's going to be a squeeze on exporting countries like Canada. And we have to figure out what we're going to do with that. We're going to have to figure out what we are going to do as this $140 billion in net exports declines over the next 20 or 30 years. And in a way, Trump's threats have called that question early. They've forced us to think about what we are going to do with this trade dependency. And it's actually a good thing. This IMF paper from 2023 shows that our dependence on oil and gas exports in a decarbonizing world, or even in a mid-transition situation, not one where we fully decarbonize, but one where we, where the world, ends up in a rough middle space, the mid-transition, Canada still is down 3% in GDP due to our dependence on trade exports. And you can see here that's second only to Russia, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. Now, we can consider those oil and gas exports, and we can look at other things like automotive, where actually we do $72 billion in exports to the United States, but actually we import about 70 billion. And so we have a rough balance in terms of our trade. And what that means is there's actually a made in Canada opportunity here. So in some areas of our trade diversification, we have a lot of trade, but actually it's balancing out. And what that means is that there's an opportunity to bring some of that trade into a fully Canadian supply chain for automotive. And I think this is a really interesting idea that we need to explore opportunities like this. But it doesn't detract from the fact that ultimately we have 140 billion in net exports to the United States that would have to be compensated for if we were going to lose trade with the United States in some way, or if the energy transition advances apace. So just to zoom out a little bit and try to think about what it is that Canada's place in the global economy actually looks like, we can actually get a pretty good view of what the global economy looks like just by looking at the world's biggest trading sectors. Oil is about 11% of global trade. Cars is about the same. Chips, so semiconductor integrated circuits alone and the machines that make them is worth 7% of global trade. So just in those three categories, we've got almost 30% in global trade. This is a really good tool for us to get our heads around what the global economy actually looks like. Then there are the machines and electrical devices that actually everything in the world is made from, and that are the basis of infrastructure all over the world, whether that's electrical infrastructure or oil and gas infrastructure, as well as all the capital goods. The machines that are used to make machines are another 25% of the world economy. Think of that as being the world's industrial base right there. Then metal and minerals are about 10%. Food and agricultural products are about 9%. And medical supplies are almost another 9%, 8.5%. So just by looking at these 7 categories, we've got 80% of world trade right there. So if we're trying to think about what we are going to offer the world, these are the categories that we need to look at. And these are and getting our heads around how we can contribute to each of these is really critical to our trade diversification strategy. Now, who needs it? Who are these big markets? And let's focus on ex-US markets, okay? The EU is 25% of global trade. This is a huge importing market. Then, if we take our close democratic partners, UK, Australia, Japan, and South Korea, they collectively are another 11% of world trade. So now we're up to 40%. We've only talked to our closest friends, right? There's a lot of talk about China and how we need to do more trade with China. But of course, today that comes with its own geopolitically difficult trade-offs, let's say, right? China's about 14% of global trade. But actually, if we look at the 10 biggest emerging markets and developing economies in the world, then we get 16% of global trade in those next 10 biggest economies. So we can actually focus on them as well and get just as big of a bang for our buck with China, especially if we can work with them to consolidate and harmonize their trading rules, build some kind of trade blocks with those large emerging and developing economies. So that, just looking at those blocks, that's 80% of the ex-US trade, okay? And so again, this is somewhere where, again, we can take something that's really complicated and big, but really just focus our thinking and actually just get down to some concrete activities. Now, just looking at the EU, Korea, Japan, and the big emerging market and developing economies, we can look at the biggest markets that they have, and we can look at whether or not Canada actually exports that thing. So down along this column, I've got where this item lies in Canada's export table right now. So do we already do a good job of exporting this particular product? You can see medical devices, automotive devices, aircraft, metal and minerals, electronics, and agricultural goods and energy goods all have really strong opportunities, really big global markets, and something that we're already good at. But we're going to have to boost each of these if we're going to actually diversify our trade. So this is a good understanding of the global market and how we can actually situate ourselves within that global market. But what are we actually good at? We want to look at what we're good at today, but we also want to look at what we're good in the future. And we can do that by looking at the areas where our exports are actually growing the fastest. And so the analysis that I'll present from here on out really looks at the fastest growing sectors in the Canadian economy. And the first thing I'm going to do is look at broad sectors, big buckets, okay? And that'll help us inform structural policy that we want to have, policy that helps a lot of different firms and a lot of different products come to market. But also we want to look at specific products, and those specific products help us to build targeted infrastructure and strategic support for specific industries and specific sub-industries, really. So let's start with the broad sectors. On the left, we've got the fastest growing broad sectors in Canada's export bucket. And I've got it benchmarked against the Canadian average here, 121% since 2022. So Canada's trade grew 21% since 2022. And here I've taken out the United States on the right-hand side. So we can get a good sense of things that we're good at and things that we're exporting actually outside of the United States. And you get some really interesting results when you start to look at the ones that went up or the ones that went down. So the ones that went up include fertilizers, copper, ships, boats, and floating structures, arms and ammunition, glass and glassware, and iron and steel. And what I'm noticing in looking at those is that I'm looking and seeing that our industrial base is desired and needed by the world, and especially the industrial base that's needed for defense industries, arms and ammunition and ships and boats, metal. These are things that the world is going to need, especially as our European partners build out their defense industry. There's a lot of opportunities for us to integrate more strongly with the Europeans in these areas. And these are all really fast growing, broad sectors in the Canadian economy. In bold here, I've got just things that interested me, things that were related to the clean economy, some of them related to defense opportunities as well as current priorities of the government. And then we can look at the ones that go down. We're actually really fast growing in railway and locomotive parts globally. There's a little bit lower on the ex-US table. Same with electrical machinery, nuclear reactors, vehicles, so looking at motor vehicles, cars, et cetera, nickel, things like that. These are all areas where actually we probably need to think about whether or not our trade infrastructure and our trade partnerships are actually as well calibrated as they could be, because we have what seems like comparative advantage in these products, but we're not exporting as many of them to the countries outside of the US as we are to the US, right? So we can lean in on our US strengths. We can lean in on these areas where we're already a strong exporter outside of the US: railway and locomotive, ships and boats, arms and ammunition, copper, fertilizer, glass, iron and steel. But we need to revamp and really think about these areas where we do have competitive advantages globally, but we're currently not growing as fast in ex-US markets as we could, although we are still growing in ex-US markets in these. So those are broad sectoral opportunities. What about specific products? Well, these are the fastest growing specific products in Canada's export table. And I'll just note that number one here is lithium-ion batteries, growing at over 1,000% over this 3-year period, right? And I've also got the value of that market. So this is growing quite fast. It's only 1.5 billion in export dollars right now. But it's growing quite rapidly. You can see here, these are motor vehicles with spark plug engines and electric motors. So these are hybrid cars, 8.5 billion. Again, growing very rapidly over this period. We have parts of lithium-ion batteries doing quite well here. We also have natural uranium growing quite rapidly and already at 4.5 billion, so a big market that could grow faster. And then one of the nice things about working with just broad open data with no priors and no theoretical architecture is that you get surprised. So I had to actually Google what a liquid dielectric transformer was. And I soon found out that Canada, alongside doing boards and panels, electric inductors, and regular electric transformers, does about $1 billion a year in exports of electrical grid equipment that the world needs. And we actually, here at the Transition Accelerator, found that we have some really world-leading firms in this sector, and we went out and had some great conversations with them to learn about their success. And we'll be bringing the lessons learned from those kinds of successes in future analysis and work and events that we'll be doing. But electrical grid equipment is another area where we are able to actually rapidly grow our exports while advancing the energy transition both at home and globally. So I want to leave you with a few recommendations as I wrap up. The first is that this trade diversification strategy should not be disconnected from our broader economic strategy. Rather, we should integrate it with our industrial strategy. Prime Minister Carney's mandate letter to all the ministers and all the government really highlighted the important role of productivity. We have a brief coming out on productivity that argues, again, that you can achieve productivity gains and make strong strategic investments in value added for natural resources in clean energy opportunity areas. You can do all these things at the same time: increase productivity, invest in natural resources, and also diversify trade. And the data is really showing us that we've got some strong opportunities in critical minerals, the EV and battery supply chain, nuclear, as well as health. And we can do this by forging backwards and forwards linkages in Canadian value chains. Really make sure that our auto supply chain goes all the way back to critical minerals. And let's get more of our auto supply chain on this side of the border while we're at it. The second thing that I think this analysis can inform is how we build out trade infrastructure. Prime Minister Carney promised a $5 billion fund, which I think is a great idea. I often worry with large funds that they'll end up being administered or implemented in a purely passive way, rather than a strategic way, where we focus exactly what our opportunities are with an analysis such as this, and use it to really focus on specific kinds of opportunities that we should spend money on. Inland containerizers would be a great way to give the provinces in the middle of our country and the territories in the middle of our country more control over their exportability. We need to think hard about our ports. One of the interesting insights that I've come across in the last couple of months is that the Korean port authorities actually integrate manufacturing into the ports. So the car basically rolls off the assembly line and onto the ship. So they've got a highly integrated shipping infrastructure. And as a small island nation, they really had to get this right. And we have a lot to learn from countries like that. And finally, when we think about nation building projects, we should be really focused on building infrastructure around these export opportunities, especially critical minerals, I think is really critical. And finally, and this is something that I don't want to say too much about because Aaron is actually the true expert on the EDC and the CCC on this call, the Export Development Corporation and the Canadian Commercial Corporation. Um, but we have ways that we can orient and focus the tools that these corporations have to use public finance in order to support Canadian exporters. And finally, we can really lead globally, as Prime Minister Carney has promised that his government will do. We really need to think about how we can lead on the creation of defense and clean energy supply chains without the United States, which would mean convening a G6 plus meeting to advance industrial cooperation for clean energy and defense, and maybe even lead the creation of a global investment strategy that will help to actually make strategic investments collectively as partners in all of this. So I really want to thank you for your time. Apologize again for sharing whatever spreadsheet I was most recently working in with you at the beginning of the call, and look forward to the discussion with Aaron and Bruce.
Great. Thanks so much, Bentley. At least it wasn't your grocery list or something. I did see trade diversification written on it. Yeah, I mean, super interesting. Tons of material there. Lots of analysis. I want to turn to you, Aaron. Before you got into politics, you served in the military. You worked as a trade lawyer. You're doing fascinating international work today. What's your reaction? A little bit to hearing Bentley, but also looking at Canada's export strengths. Bentley was referencing all of the aspects that enter into the increasing defense spending. Where do you see opportunities for us to do more of for a competitive, diversified trade strategy?
Bruce, and I want to thank you and Dan and Sarah and the whole team for this opportunity to have an important conversation. And the most important part of Bentley's work is its just focus on developing a strategy. And I think the strategy is helpful because he's done ex-US with the continued uncertainty from our friends to the south and President Trump continue. We've got a plan and we've got opportunities to not only strengthen some of those growing sectors, but to build new ones where, you know, 70% of the world or 40% of our allies might be looking for more products that we can quickly get to market to help fill in the gap that we may have in a prolonged basis from the United States. But also, it was important that there is also a strategy of resolving the situation with the United States. But as I've said to people, Bruce, in my chats around the country over the last few months, we have to make sure that even if we resolve the situation with the U.S. or get down to a lower tariff rate, a 10% general tariff, that we don't abandon these diversification efforts in the future. I was involved in the European trade deal, CETA, Trans-Pacific Partnership. When I was a brand new MP, Prime Minister Harper asked me to do some trade work because I'd done trade in the private sector. We were doing that because after the Great Recession, the US economy was sluggish. So we wanted to diversify, but it's tough. So once the US took back into gear at the end of the Obama administration and in the run up to COVID, why would you come up with a port strategy, as Bentley so helpfully outlined to us, when you can just throw something on a truck or a rail line and sell all your widgets to the United States? So what I hope is investors and exporters look at these long-term diversification strategies, invest in them, have the government partner and prioritize them, so that ultimately the goal would be to regain the U.S. market access and have a margin of excellence beyond that. Final thing I'll say with respect to transition and how Canada can not only be a part of it domestically, but our companies and our investors can win on it. Look at some of those positive trends that Bentley outlined. Copper, it is the lifeline that connects the electrification of an economy. It's why copper stocks and why many gold companies are focusing as much on copper as they are on gold. Nuclear, which is kind of flat, but I would say to Bentley, and I'm sure he agrees, there's a lag time with nuclear. So I was a big advocate 10 years ago of nuclear when nobody would talk about it. Now we have an SMR in Darlington that OPG is building that is being watched by dozens of utilities across the Americas. we're seeing large-scale nuclear rollout. So we're in now this renaissance where siting, regulatory review is there. We already have the export capacity, right from the fuel to reactors, to really benefit, I'd say, 4 or 5 years from now, when you're going to see the renaissance turn into reality. And then that grid piece, I'm really glad you highlighted the transformer piece, Bentley, because the electrification economy, we are not ready for it. So Ontario last year, the IESO, the Independent Electrical System Operator, said that Ontario in the next 2 decades will need 75% more electricity on its grid. 75%. And we want that to come from emission-free sources. So nuclear, hydro, blending in renewables as well. So the transformers, the infrastructure that will need to build out the electrification is huge. It's the backbone that we already have a competitive advantage. And it's not just the transformers on the poles or at the edge of change in the grid. It's also software and optimization as you're bringing batteries in and out, as you're making sure renewable generation, when there's more than you need, can be stored in a battery. We have software companies like Blue Wave AI in Ottawa and others that are optimizing grids, which is equally important, because in conservation, I used to sit on the board of a utility. The power plant you don't have to build because of conservation or optimization is the best power plant, because you're actually making your grid more efficient. So I love the data approach. I love the strategic approach. And then I think EDC, CCC, our trade commissioners, need to be also focused with almost a mandate letter for every person in the government from the Prime Minister to really leverage our strengths now. So looking forward to more of a discussion, but those are my top lines, Bruce.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much, Aaron. And as you know, the Transition Accelerator is doing a considerable amount of work on the electrification economy, and I couldn't agree with you more that similar to your other remarks, we really should have been further ahead of the curve on this a number of years ago. It was clear to some of us that this was coming, and even the example, and maybe I don't know if you have thoughts on it, Aaron, from your perspective, but we're talking here largely about Canada exporting to other international markets. As we all know, we do a pretty poor job of trading internally in this country, including our isolated electricity markets. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that piece quickly for us.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Bruce, because I'll tell you my biggest frustrations from my 10 and a half years in politics, starting out in government, which, yes, the old expression that the worst day in government is better than the best day in opposition, that is true. I've lived it. And then the rest of my time in opposition, the amount of times I had $1 for every time a Canadian exporter or innovator said, I have sales abroad faster than I can sell things in my own country, and I could grow better if it looked like my own country supported me. I heard that I'd be a rich man if I had $1 every time. How can we change that? Well, we can change that really easily in this era of buy Canadian and elbows up. Let's really try to make sure that we do buy from our own supply chains, that we keep supply chains as local as we can in respect of trade laws. But as trade is a bit uncertain, this is a time to actually show preference. And the veteran in me loves some of the defense stats that Bentley talked about. You're allowed to show domestic preference in defense and security industries. So that's permitted under trade law. So the fact that we already have an export-oriented economy, people probably know CAE, the world's most successful flight simulator company, but we've got tons of smaller players too that have important contracts. And now that NATO is being shaken by an isolationist US administration, I was in Europe a few months ago. Europeans want to do more defense, security, cyber trade with Canada and vice versa. So I think those are also impressive numbers that I think we can build up a defense industry through more of the 2% spending. Prime Minister Carney's committed to that. And then we should very quickly try and develop or grow export markets as we're buying Canadian. Let's start exporting at the same time. It gives those companies more revenues, more investor dollars will flow in. And I'll tell you, EDC a few years ago would not touch defense. Now they're being basically told to. We cannot have picking and choosing by government agencies that are developing exports. So we don't export arms to bad countries, but if we have folks, particularly with NATO and friendly countries, this is a part of the economy we need to have sales abroad because we don't have a big enough domestic spend at the time. So I think there's really promising data that Bentley outlined and a really all hands on deck approach in Canada now.
Great, excellent. Thanks so much. Bentley, I'm gonna use Aaron's comments to segue into some of what's come out of the Carney government, and specifically the announcement the other day that came out in the single mandate letter on the collective core priorities. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how you see that aligning to your analysis, Bentley. Are there opportunities here to expedite the nation building agenda that the government's talking about? Specific things where you see this kind of analysis and strategic thinking being aligned with and or helpful or compatible with what you're seeing from the federal government.
Yeah, there's huge opportunities there. And one thing I really wanted to pick up from what Aaron just said was that we actually have a whole architecture in the trade commissioners and in the embassies to help firms get connected to other firms in other countries. But we actually don't have a similar infrastructure domestically to get firms connected to other firms domestically. And so much of what good industrial strategy is not necessarily to design big fiscal tools or to, actually put a lot of money on the table, although that's the way we've interpreted the charge mainly in this country. But actually, good industrial strategy is really about increasing the connectivity of the firms to expertise, to universities, to government inside our own economy. And so we actually don't have great tools actually for increasing connectivity amongst supply chains and industries inside the country. And I think that there's a lesson there actually about translating the strength that we have doing that internationally to doing it domestically. I just thought that was such an interesting comment that Aaron made.
I just
In terms of
Bentley, sorry, Bentley,
yeah.
on that, is this a role for BDC? I mean, we're talking about EDC here. We do have a domestically focused economic development agency.
Well, I think BDC, the culture of BDC is broadly as as a group of accountants that are doing due diligence on loans and projects. And I think actually that's fine. Like that's what BDC is and should be. I think there's another way to do it though, which is that the government could work closely with what we've called in many transition accelerator publications going back 3 or 4 years now, working with what we call independent intermediaries or third-party organizations in each of the sectors that are independent from both firms and from government that can serve as a meeting place for indigenous communities, expertise, civil society organizations, government, and firms, and using those places as an area to get strategy and connectivity. I think that's the place to do it rather than doing it inside an organization whose main job is to do financial due diligence. So yeah, just setting that aside and getting back to your original question about the mandate letter and building new relationships was number one for Prime Minister Carney in that mandate letter. So I think that's really important. It's the second half of the sentence, so maybe it'll get lost. That's one problem with being lumped together there with managing a new U.S. relationship. But I think it is important to link the two halves of that number one in the mandate letter. Managing a new U.S. relationship goes hand in hand with building new international partnerships. You literally cannot revise your relationship with the United States unless you are building your strength and your opportunities with other parts of the world. And that means building up those economic opportunities and those economic relationships. So I do think that that number one priority in the mandate letter is really important. And as you alluded to, the idea that what we need to do here in order to build the strongest economy in the G7 is build this nation through strong and measurable nation building projects, I think is really exactly in line with the analysis that I presented here, where critical minerals projects are a huge part of the global market and a huge part of our opportunity, but we've just moved too slow on them. We've just moved too slow on moving those projects forward. And most of the national conversation has really been focused on permitting, but easily just as important is demand side certainty, a clear statement to investors that we are actually going to buy Canadian metal and use Canadian metal in Canadian supply chains of all kinds, right? So we have an opportunity to just make that situation more clear. And then just as important as permitting, at least, is building out the infrastructure around these projects, right? Building roads, creating electricity grids that get all the way to mine sites, really making logistics, rail and shipping logistics easier for our key mining regions. There are real opportunities to do nation building projects that actually will deliver critical minerals and other forms of natural resource exports in a way that really, I think, strongly aligns with Prime Minister Carney's vision. And a third thing, which is maybe a little bit more abstract, if you will, that I think really dovetails nicely with the mandate letter is Prime Minister Carney's charge to the ministries for them to identify measurable objectives and outcomes that they could achieve, right? Unless you're actually doing deep analysis and have deep analysis, it's actually pretty difficult to specify a performance objective, such as increase your ex-US trade by X billion dollars, or increase your ex-US trade by X%. You actually can't even specify what the target is unless you're deep in an understanding of the strategic situation. And so I actually think that his charge to the ministries, you go out and identify which key indicators we and the Canadian people are going to hold you accountable to, is actually directly consistent with the kind of approach that we're laying out here, but also that we've been advocating for over 2 or 3 years now, that the Canadian government needs to lay out specific economic objectives that are keyed to its climate objectives, rather than starting with an emissions reductions approach and then trying to back out what we're going to do in order to meet this really abstract emissions reductions target. Instead, let's talk about nation building, the investments that we're going to make, and then talk about the effects that those are going to have on transforming our energy system.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Bentley. Thanks also. I think you each touched on the importance of working with Indigenous communities, and certainly our work, Transition Accelerator, we see the absolute necessity. We're also talking about accessing critical minerals. We're talking about the need to build out electricity systems across what we know will be Indigenous lands. So how do we balance the economic opportunity with sustainability and Indigenous sovereignty? And maybe, Aaron, if you don't mind, I'll ask you to comment on that critical issue for us in Canada.
A very important question, Bruce. Thank you. And ironically, one of my calls earlier this morning was with a great friend of mine, JP Galiju, a great First Nation leader, somebody that I knew in the private sector and then relied on for advice when I was in public life. And the great thing about economic reconciliation is there's now vehicles ensuring that Indigenous communities, First Nation Development Corps, aren't just supplying workers for mines or sites. There is an expectation of equity participation and partnership in these projects. But this wasn't there when I was in the Harper cabinet, for example, and we were having Idle No More as a movement. Now you've got groups like the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, advisors like JP and Burnt Christmas, and a number of national folks with deep business backgrounds that are helping carve real equity participation. You look at the Globe and Mail today, the discussion about Bill 5 in Ontario. I really think Indigenous leaders need to recognize that if projects are going to be sped up for critical minerals or anything else, this is not at the expense of First Nations like it might have been even 15 years ago. There's incredible opportunity for economic benefit, for Indigenous engagement and ownership in some cases. And power distribution is a great example, Bruce. I worked with OPG for years. I did some energy work as a lawyer. When Darlington and some of these major projects were being built a generation ago, there was not even any token consultation. Now, when there are transmission lines that may go through the Ring of Fire, for example, there will be tolling arrangements for First Nations to actually benefit consistently and provide a revenue stream for a nation to really provide long-term economic and social benefit for their people. So I think we're at a perfect time for Canada because I think some of the social license we're seeing with Canadians being more supportive of large projects or pipelines or transmission or interties and decarbonizing our national grid and having interties. We need to take advantage of this, and I don't think First Nations need to be worried about it. There's now an expectation both in the public and private spheres that they will be partners. And I still have some scars of trying to get my party, and they ultimately did support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One of my personal advisors on that, Wilton Littlechild from Alberta, was one of the pioneers of that as an early Indigenous leader. And it was not about saying no to projects. It was making sure that there was more than tokenism in terms of jobs and opportunity. We wanted partnership. We wanted to feel valued. And I'm really excited about projects like Cedar LNG and the Nisga'a have their own initiative in British Columbia. These will be transformative, uh, lifetime changing. What I've said, we as Canadians owe Indigenous Canadians, the next generation. There should be trauma transfer. There should be wealth transfer and opportunity transfer for First Nations. So I'm hoping we can, as in Ontario, get past some of this resistance about moving quickly, because we won't see the capital come into our country needed for critical minerals and other things unless there's some degree of certainty that we can get things done.
Great. Hey, thanks so much for that, Aaron. We're going to wrap up this part. I've got a zillion questions. It'll take me longer than 15 minutes to read them all from our participants. But maybe, Bentley, I'll just ask you this one final question, which is, countries talk about trade diversification. I mean, Aaron, you touched on the idea that this was an important thing 10 years ago. We haven't really, I don't think, done a great job. I guess, again, as you both said, it was when you have one of the largest markets, a few kilometers south of you, it's pretty easy to want to just keep shipping stuff there. It does seem like it's a bit of a tough lift. I'll weave in one of the questions I read, for example, like, are some of these things feasible to ship globally? Can we actually manufacture cars, ideally use more for our domestic use, but is it economically feasible for us to be shipping cars to Europe, or do they want to buy our cars? Things like that. And then are there things that we can be doing, like what has and hasn't worked in trade diversification, and what do we actually have to do beyond the strategic thinking and understanding to actually make it happen, make it deliver? And maybe I'll get Bentley and you, Aaron, both to comment on that as our final formal questions here.
These are excellent questions, Bruce. My temptation is to answer them with data, as is my want. The EU is the world's biggest exporter of motor vehicles and motor vehicle parts. Cars ship just fine. In fact, we import about $60 billion of cars across the sea from mostly Asia, but some from Europe as well, but mostly from South Korea and Japan. The Korean automakers specifically really think about having a global strategy in terms of their production in order to create social license and local buy-in for their brands, but they produce and sell globally in a global strategy. And they do that by having world-leading efficiency and really strong management and really strong industrial strategy for the automotive sector and for their international shipping sector, which is fully integrated with all of the big conglomerates. Hyundai was a shipbuilder before it was an auto builder, for example. So definitely these things can be done, but it's a highly competitive global market out there. And if we are going to compete in that global market, we're competing not just with the Koreans and their world-leading, really affordable electric vehicles, but China and its world-leading and really affordable electric vehicles. So I think that there's a difficult lift to get auto exporting, but I do think that we could reduce our reliance on the auto sector with the United States. We could increase the sales of Canadian-made final assembled cars in Canada. That would be a great performance objective for an industry minister. I'm going to increase demand for Canadian-built cars 10% or something like that, right? And think about how they're going to do that. Now I'm going to think about increasing the content of those cars to make the content of those cars more Canadian by 15% or something like that. These are definable objectives that we could do that I think the trade tables tell us there will be a slight drop in efficiency because we have so many efficiency gains by having that cross-border integration with the United States, but not really severe ones, right? These are going to be minor adjustments in terms of our overall productivity and efficiency in order to accommodate those kinds of changes. So I do think that's really realistic. Other things on there, which I think are interesting, are things like glass, which is quite heavy and breaks, but ships internationally surprisingly well because we've got good methodologies for packing crates full of glass. And glass, again, is not the thing that you think of when you think of the Canadian economy. You don't think we're a world competitive glass industry, but it's such an interesting one in those tables because as soon as you start to deeply think about what glass is, it's just a really energy dense product, right? It has a lot of electrons in it, right? And right now we take a lot of raw electrons and we ship them to the United States. Well, that's just like taking raw lumber and shipping it to China, or taking raw lumber and turning it into pellets and shipping it to the UK for bioenergy. This is a very low value added export, just exporting energy or biomass, right? Whereas if we take those energy and those electrons and we turn them into glass, then we've created a high value product. Something that's energy dense is something that is value dense, and something that is value dense trades really well. And so a lot of these, another step in the analysis would be to actually weight these things by how fast they're growing and how value dense they are as shippable products. And we didn't try to do that in this analysis. But I do think that they are very realistic. The thing that Aaron highlighted, which I think is the real challenge, is keeping the economic motivation of this moment up when things look like they could return to normal and we could just continue to slide back into the geopolitical lull that put us asleep, basically, effectively, for the last 80 years, right? Maybe even more intensely since the end of the Cold War. But we can't allow that geopolitical lull to come back. We can't allow ourselves to be exposed in the way that we currently are exposed. That means taking our defense, our national defense seriously. It means taking our industrial strategy seriously. And the only way I think we can do that is not by turning it into a political thing, but by making sure that the coalition around our industrial strategy is really strong, so that firms and experts and civil society organizations are all reinforcing this priority on behalf of the government, so that they will take it seriously, even when it does not necessarily make political hay in order to deliver on it.
Great, thanks. Aaron, do you have thoughts on sort of those issues in particular, or?
Or sometimes, I grew up, my dad worked at General Motors in Oshawa, so I've been a big booster of the auto industry, but sometimes we spend too much time on the auto industry as the exemplar for trade. Bentley's data shows exactly what we need to do on terms of strategy. I'll use an example. I had the honor of going to Seoul to help finalize Canada's first free trade agreement with an Asian nation, our bilateral FTA with South Korea. And at the time, we looked at the prioritizations, and it was interesting. Agriculture, in fact, deals that U.S. and Australia had was hurting our beef exports. Think Korean barbecue. That food component of our trade exports, and that global trade index that Bentley showed. Food is particularly more important as we're going to see food insecurity increase in the coming years, in part because of climate change. You look at countries in Africa, there's already red alarms going off. You're seeing Brazil transform whole regions of their country to meet food needs. So the other things with South Korea, after agriculture, which was our lead, uranium Why? Because they were a can-do country.
Mm.
Port Hope, the Finnish uranium product was another huge export to that country. So I think what we have to do is leverage things that we're already engaged in on a global trade, as per Bentley's direction. And then something the Carney government could do to maintain this diversification strategy in light of potentially Trump walking back some of the tariffs as he's want to do hour to hour. Let's lock in a bit of a diversification fund where we used to do it with trade funds to allow industry groups to attend world trade fairs and to really get our participants out there and then help them maintain those 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 trade routes. Because as I said, even if things normalize with the US, why wouldn't we want to be more dominant in a few categories by being a world leader outside of North America? So I think the EU is very attractive for that. Lots of interest in doing more. We saw the medical products category. That's one that we've been a pioneer in. We can do a lot more. The electrification agenda, both from a resource and from a technology side. So I think showing a bit more ambition has to be part of this as a country. And so I do like the single mandate letter concept in terms of setting a plan. And we should unleash not just the cabinet, but the agencies and our diplomatic representation for an all hands on deck. Let's really secure the future by winning for a change as opposed to just participating.
Mm. Great, great. Thanks, Aaron. The good news too is we are weaving in some of the questions that are coming in, specifically related to one around food as a major export opportunity for Canada. Also, the need to focus on something that I've found frustrating for years working on these issues, and you raised, Aaron, which is having a solid strategic understanding to procurement of things from companies in Canada. So someone referencing electric utilities, not necessarily buying Canadian products. I've heard oil and gas pipelines being made with steel from China instead of steel from Canada. So I think we probably need to be focusing on that as well. And quite a few
Can I
questions.
speak to that for a second, Bruce? Because I think you're
Certainly.
right. Like I've heard of cases of public utilities who are essentially operating like private sector enterprises, but serve a public good mandate. And in Ontario, most of them, their directors are city councilors, and they're big, Toronto Hydro, Ottawa Hydro, the Starstream, there's a number that are major electricity utilities. If they don't have a buy local strategy, there's a failure of management with those organizations and their mayors and the provincial ministers in charge should be sorting them out because they have a public good mandate built into their regulated rate structure. And we're encountering some of these organizations thinking that that they don't have this public mandate. And what's interesting about energy and energy security, we should think of our grid as a national defense asset
Mm-hmm.
because look at what Russia did in Ukraine. They've launched hacking attacks and targeted the grid. For Canadians, we send our troops overseas all the time, but if a bad actor knocked out our grid or our financial infrastructure, these cyber investments are as important for our national defense as anything else. And what's good about that is if it's security, including energy security, you can show a preference by hiring and buying local. So I think we have to be smarter, and this is all levels of government, not just the feds
Yep.
who have the global
Yep.
trade, but municipalities. City of Toronto is a major purchaser of goods and services. So how do we make sure this Team Canada concept doesn't fritter out in a couple of months? As a patriot, I want us to maintain this for good,
Mhm.
and we just
Mhm.
have to be smart.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, governments are the largest procurers of all things in Canada. And I know, having also been worked in the electricity sector, the mantra, the low cost mantra, unfortunately, often overrides things. And I think we really need to, as you say, Aaron, be thinking more of a Team Canada and national security perspective on this, and not just simply the cheapest stuff we can, get our hands on. I'm going to turn and try to weave a couple of things. There's quite a few questions related to supply chain, both in terms of challenges in that we don't always, for example, if we're providing a widget into an American-dominated supply chain, it might be hard to find another supply chain to get that widget into. So that's one sort of challenge that was raised, Bentley, and I'll ask you to comment on it. And the other one was the kind of related more to the positive side of supply chains. And I know, Bentley, a lot of your research looks at this. So rather than just looking at what product, whether it's, a finished product, and looking up the value chain to make sure that we're producing the inputs into that finished product, or whether it's the resources and making sure that we're providing value added manufacturing to those. I mean, where do you see that fitting into this strategy, Bentley?
Yeah, I think that the value chain opportunities are really critical. So one of the fastest growing ex-US exports is ores and concentrates. But I actually think that we should not be trying to actually boost ores and concentrates exports because, again, it's a low value added opportunity. I think what we should be trying to do is build out processing so that we can export the next stage, right? And we're already exporting a lot of ores and concentrates, which are being turned into higher value added products, which are being re-imported later in the value chain. And therefore, we've let somebody else capture the value add on our own copper, for example, rather than building a new, smelter here in Canada. So I think that we do have to think strategically about where on the value chain a lot of these opportunities arise, where a lot of these opportunities lie. I think food is a great example. Actually, the agricultural sector generally has been very focused on value add, and a lot of the fastest growing agricultural products in the analysis have to do with value added products in the food space. So looking at like frozen meat products as opposed to meat. And that also means that you can ship it to places other than the United States because it doesn't have to be fresh. So those value added opportunities in agriculture, I think, are really critical and part of what we're talking about here. In terms of switching things out from the US supply chain into others for specific kinds of components, on the one hand, the downside of that is this stuff takes a really long time. Vendors have to find relationships, they have to build those relationships over time, and there has to be a buyer and a seller in international markets. So this takes time to do that matchmaking. This is, of course, what EDC is great at, and the trade commissioners across the world are great at, is doing that matchmaking. And it just takes time for that machinery to operate. On the other hand, there are specific opportunities in automotive and defense where we are trying to get out of the US, or maybe we are trying to reshore some of what we're currently doing in the US defense supply chains, where we're doing lots of exports to the US defense supply chains, and maybe build up our exports in the defense supply chain to Europe. And so I think there are these direct opportunities where the matchmaking can be accelerated, especially in clean energy and defense. And so I think that doesn't have to take as long as it normally would take by a natural process, and by rather we can actually do strategic investment partnerships and strategic trade partnerships in critical sectors with our partners and accelerate that process.
Great. Thanks, Bentley. I don't know, Aaron, if you want to jump in on that at all, or I have a political question for you that it's
just a quick point.
Yep.
Diversification strategy for the country is, and we should have specified this, should not just be for where you're selling to. It should include your supply chain. So diversifying the inputs for a manufacturer, for a player, needs to be part of this permanent strategy we have. If we didn't learn from COVID the fact that supply chains needed to be diversified, you think of the shortages we had after COVID. It's because in many cases, or the chip shortages we've had, like there's been so many learnings on why you need multiple options that you can keep alive. And this is something where our EDC and Trade Commissioner Service is good. They've been a bit behind on this piece actually. And so diversification means not just final market, but inputs in your supply chain too.
Great. Thank you. And So I'm going to try to weave a couple more themes in to questions here, and just for the participants, we are running until 2:15, so please stay engaged. I can tell you we could run for another hour with the number of questions that have come in. It's a couple of people commenting on the challenge we have in Canada, where so much of our great companies end up getting purchased by other countries, companies in other countries. So we talk about our Canadian supply chains, but many of the companies that we're talking about operating here are in fact owned outside of Canada. So the decision making isn't necessarily coming out of this country. So, a question, for example, is, should we have tighter restrictions on foreign ownership of some of these more important critical supply chain components? Another one is basically, how do we put in place structures that create more value for the domestically owned industries? And I think the procurement piece also ties into this, but I don't know, Bentley, if you've got thoughts on that, and then I'll ask Aaron too.
Yeah, I think that we do have a real strong opportunity there. I think that just go back to one thing that Aaron said first, and then I'll come back to that. On the energy infrastructure, I think that we also have to think about not just the liability of those kinds of energy assets, but also pipelines are a really big defense asset liability as well. And so diversifying our energy portfolio in this country is also a defense maneuver. And I think if we really start taking our defense infrastructure seriously, we'll see how exposed we are in terms of that as well. And that's another thing that got targeted in the Ukraine war. But in terms of foreign ownership, I don't think we should be restricting foreign ownership. I think, like, again, the Korean strategy is always in my head. And the perception of industrial strategy is that you have to be protectionist in some fundamental way in order to be good at it. The Koreans were very open to the world, both in terms of trade and in terms of imports, when they did their industrial strategy, because they believed strongly that competition with the world was part of how you made and disciplined your firms into world leaders. And that was a strength of what they were trying to do. And still to this day, it's what they're trying to do. And again, China is often talked about, but few people understand how the Chinese use foreign firms in order to discipline their domestic firms. And so being open to international ownership and international competition in their domestic markets is part of how they achieved what they're currently achieving. Not to say that they aren't squeezing out and pushing out foreign firms right now. But what they did do, which we need to learn how to do, is support their domestic firms. We have too much reliance on foreign companies, and we don't do enough to scale and grow our own companies. And again, this is something that's at the heart of the productivity challenge. The small and medium-sized enterprises that are going to scale are the most productive firms. We have a report coming out on this, and so I don't want to give I don't want to give a coup on our own report. We have to let that report speak when it comes out. But one of the key findings is that we actually have to scale our own homegrown firms if we want to be more productive, and that will create more domestic ownership, right? But only if we actually back our own firms. And this gets back to something that Aaron mentioned earlier about how firms just don't feel supported in their own country. And so especially innovative firms, especially firms that are trying to reach global markets, they need a lot of support in that phase when they move from 20 to 50 to 500 employees. And in that phase, they need a lot more support, both financially and in terms of the infrastructure and logistics and all the other things that go along with building a true trading diversification strategy.
If I can just add to that, I'll speak quickly to one of the items that I'm actually quite happy that Prime Minister Carney seems to be stealing from my platform from 21 is the flow through share concept. You may recall, Bruce, that one of the things that we worked with the Canadian Council of Innovators, Jim Balzilli, a whole range of folks on why are we losing these companies beyond Series B fundraising and they go to the States. There hasn't been enough private capital freed up. Well, the flow through share helps do that and helps give the discipline where the investor will do the due diligence on the promising technology or the promising product and provide enough capital by flowing through the costs to that investor. So it is a good tax assist, but it will free up a ton of capital for sectors of the economy that we want to grow homegrown champions. So clean tech was one that I talked about in 2021 about giving them this favorable
Yeah.
flow through structure, which the mining sector, that we became world leaders in mining finance in part due to this tax vehicle. Um, Providing that, and it was in the Liberal platform, providing that in a couple of core areas of the economy at a time that these companies want to stay here, but they need to access capital as they're growing their revenues and they're really not turning a profit yet, but they need to get funding. I think that's one way that if the Carney government moves quickly on it, um, we can take advantage of some of these emerging sectors, and particularly technology players that will help, not just in the transition, but even more broadly in defense and other spaces. There's an absence of sufficient capital, and because we live on the border of the most voracious market with massive pots of capital, it's hard to resist the draw. So we have to be smart to not just have government pick winners and losers, use the tax system to allow private investors to do that.
Great, great. Thanks very much, Aaron. I'm going to ask just a quick question for you, Bentley, that came up here, and then where was I? A few people have referenced the housing sector, and we know housing is affordable housing is a critical issue. The Carney government has talked about the need to build houses. A few questions are weaving in ideas around, can we be doing something in the housing market that has export opportunities? Are there things, domestic businesses that we can be supporting? I know, Bentley, you've done work on mass timber and modular structural wood products in the building sector. There's also, heat pumps, there's electronics, there's thermostats. We've got some big Canadian companies doing all of that. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have a really strong opportunity, and we were really excited to see in the Liberal platform and in Prime Minister Carney's campaign the prominent place of mass timber, coming on the back of the mass timber roadmap that we did last year in conjunction with the Forest Products Association of Canada and the Canada Wood Council, where we brought together 100 firms and partners from across the whole value chain for mass timber building, all the way from forestry to modular and prefabricated building manufacturers, in order to get them all on the same page and build a common strategy all together. An example of an independent intermediary helping do strategy. We're really excited to see one of our top recommendations, which was that the government should do bulk procurement of mass timber in the Liberal platform, where they were promising to use Build Canada Homes as a government procurement entity in order to help the mass timber firms get to scale. And that's exactly what they need to do in order to be big enough, actually, to provide demand pull on Canadian wood, but also to reach the scale necessary to compete in international markets, which is certainly a possibility. We currently import a lot of mass timber panels from Europe, even though we are mass timber producers. And that's partly because of the inefficiencies in our supply chain, which we've got to improve by getting to scale, but also because, the strong support that those exporters from Europe have domestically in order to do that. But the prefab opportunities are enormous. This is an area where we can increase productivity enormously by moving to models where we do a lot more offsite construction. We use a lot more CNC machines and a lot more automated tools in the way that we prepare wall panels and housing units, create assembly line structures in order to build modular units that can be really excellent for like dorms and apartments and government buildings and things like that, as well as the missing middle part of the housing market, where we can build 4 to 6 story buildings in really efficient ways. And all these are export products. All of these have the ability to be exported. And then the other thing we'll do, we haven't talked too much about services. They're a relatively small part of our export basket, so that's why we didn't do too much focus on it. And any one service sector is very small, because once you start to open up the service sector, tourism ends up being the biggest category, actually, of global services. But we would be able to build a service industry, I think, in modular and prefab construction, doing design and construction overseas, and really working on the logistics around moving prefabricated and modular elements, especially into a big Asian growing market.
Great, and thanks for weaving services in. There were a couple questions on that as well. Aaron, I'm going to turn to you. This is a combination of knowing that you've always been collaborative in the work that you've done, and we've seen recently not necessarily the greatest collaboration politically, either whether it's between opposition parties in Ottawa or whether it's Fed-Prov relations. A couple of questions have come up around the importance of, and maybe ideas around, I would say particularly since I think we're seeing a much closer alignment across governments on the need to focus on the economy. Any thoughts from your experiences, Aaron, on importance of, need of, and opportunity for collaboration at more of a political level?
I'm very, very happy to see that. And what is interesting with the provinces, whether it's Bill 15 in British Columbia or Bill 5 in Ontario, there's all of them are talking getting projects done faster. All of them are talking housing, and particularly in large urban settings, as Bentley talked about. The federal government has now formed its cabinet last week. It's going to be, it says its mandate. There's an opportunity, given the threat of trade disruption with the US, to really finally have a all hands on deck approach. And municipalities have an important role here, particularly on the housing side of things, for us to really modernize our economy. And First Nations are a part of that. We already talked about this earlier. So I hope a collaborative approach has been heard. My former party, or my party, I was former leader, I guess, is a bit in a weird quandary in that the leader's not in the House. But the good thing is the interim parliamentary leader, Andrew Scheer, has indicated a willingness to collaborate on trade-related issues with the U.S. So I hope our country captures this moment where we have Indigenous partnerships, where we have general alignment, and we have amazing data that Bentley so capably took us through to really set ourselves up for success. Since Laurier, we've been saying the next century belongs to Canada and all these sorts of things. But these slogans need to be more than painted on the wall at an Indigo. The world needs more Canada. We have to get a little bit more ambitious. We have to do elbows up and smarten up. And on certain things, whether it's the Arctic and opportunities there, whether it's this national housing dilemma that is really causing a generational divide, we have to set aside some of these turf wars to actually say we're going to get stuff done. So when Prime Minister Carney used the World War II veteran housing sort of model, that played perfectly to what Bentley's saying on prefab and modular stuff that we could do here quickly, and then at the same time take that internationally. So let's try and make Canada win and get not just our elbows up, but get our aggression up. We've got a lot to offer. Let's kick some butt in the next few years, and hopefully the partisanship will eventually come back. So let's make sure we take as much advantage of things now.
Bruce, I think Aaron just named this report. Whenever I end up writing it, I think "Elbows Up and Smarten Up" that's an excellent title. I'm gonna steal that.
Right. I'm gonna go with "Let's Kick Butt." So a fantastic session. Thank you so much. A great way to end us off, Aaron. Really wise words. Bentley, your analysis and comments and smarts on all this, hugely appreciated. And thanks to the Transition Accelerator, and thanks, of course, to all of the participants today. We have fantastic questions. I wish we could have answered them all. And please stay tuned, and we look forward to participating in our future events, and keep an eye out for the Transition Accelerator reports that are coming out. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks.